In approximately the 8th century AD, wealthy people who owned horses believed they could fight on horseback using spears and swords. This was the age of Charles the Great. In their conquests, the Franks increasingly mounted horses to develop their offensive success as true cavalry, rather than as mounted infantry. Thus, the first knights emerged. 100 years later, Charles the Bald called on all men who could afford horses and weapons to respond to the call of war, to quickly repel the constant and massive Viking raids. These new riders, similar to the cataphracts and clibanarii of antiquity, could fight much more effectively thanks to stirrups and new saddles. So, did infantry ever try to chop off horses' legs? The short answer is yes, but the longer answer is much more complex than just taking a sword, waiting for the moment and making the enemy's horse disabled with one swing. In the conditions of infantry formation, cutting off a horse's legs was quite difficult. Infantry formation was how people fought, or at least tried, to fight for most of our history. Isolated infantrymen were easy prey for organized squads or riders. In the Middle Ages, the infantry certainly had large and powerful cutting weapons, but how to use them to strike horses' legs without breaking formation? To do this, they would have to step forward, but breaking formation was far from the best idea against shock cavalry. It was much safer to stay very close to each other with sturdy and very long spears protruding as far as possible. Before the pikes reappeared on the European battlefield, the infantry was armed mostly with spears about 2 to 3 meters long. The medieval knightly lance was the same. It could protrude from the front and sides of the horse for 1.5 to 2 meters, which was fraught with a high risk of getting a lance in the face when trying to cut off the horse's legs. In fact, the knightly lance always, or almost always, exceeded the reach of any infantry cold weapon, except for the pikes of the new time, but even then, with some reservations. Therefore, for infantry, it was much more pleasant to use a weapon that would at least compare in range with a knightly weapon and could hit the horse before it was too late. It so happens that with weapons like this, horses are usually stabbed in the chest rather than having their legs chopped off, but the main thing is the length. It's usually a foolish idea to break formation to go chop a horse's legs, but of course sometimes you have no choice. Horses move fast, and your window of opportunity is often small, but this applies to all kinds of combat with cold weapons. You should understand that a dense square formation of infantry with long poles can withstand a cavalry attack only if each member of such a square can overcome the desire to flee because of the wall of horse meat coming at them. However, it should be emphasized that this works because horses also do not want to die. When we talk about people with sharp poles withstanding a cavalry attack, we do not mean that horses literally throw themselves on the spear and die. The cavalry attack does not work that way. If there is no terrible accident, the attack will look like this. The infantry remains in place, and the horses either deflect to the side or stop a meter away from the spear tips with some chance of throwing the rider. Therefore, this would be the worst-case scenario. In fact, a horse can knock down and trample one person and overcome one line, but a dense, deep formation will be equivalent to a concrete wall that a horse will not want to crash into. This excerpt from the 1970 film Waterloo provides an accurate portrayal of how cavalry attacks were conducted in real life. Cavalry riders were often forced to direct their horses toward infantry formations until they made contact. However, if an opportunity presented itself, such as a gap in the formation, riders would attempt to break through, even if it ultimately proved unsuccessful. The goal of cavalry was to strike fear into their enemies and cause them to flee, thus allowing the riders to attack from behind with minimal risk. A poorly trained early medieval militia needs a lot of effort to overcome the fear of tons of horsepower rushing at them. This is an element of psychological warfare that is inseparable from any cavalry attack. In general, medieval spearmen and modern pikemen have much more advantages. For instance, a well-coordinated unit of French gendarmes could dismantle a weakly trained pikeman formation, not necessarily by breaking their ranks and charging through, but rather by provoking the pikemen to throw their spears and flee in retreat. Although the rise of new tactics in the early modern era and the expansion of cities rendered classical knights mostly useless, there were still instances where heavily armored knights wielding long spears could successfully penetrate infantry units. However, in order to compensate for their disadvantage in reach against the increasing prevalence of pikes and firearms, nobles had to abandon their spears in favor of pistols and reduce their armor to thick breastplates. But what about individual people? Small conflicts are much more characteristic of medieval warfare than large battles, so there were many opportunities to encounter cavalry without the advantage of spear formation. In these cases, people aimed precisely at the legs and any other part of the horse they could reach. You could argue that a war horse is an expensive trophy that should be kept safe if possible, and that is true. However, we should not assume that medieval soldiers or mercenaries always hesitated to kill a horse. Even in knightly tourney combat, horses were targeted alongside their riders. Pietro del Monte, master of the Knights Hospitaller, wrote,
"Weapons should always be aimed upward to wound the horse, and since it has no armor on its lower body, it can be easily killed. When two riders engage in combat, it is useful to direct your lance at the enemy's horse, unless you have protective gear that will preserve your person."
Pseudo Peter von Danzig, an anonymous fencing master of the 15th century, gives the following recommendations.
Keep in mind when you close in, if he remains on horseback and charges at you with a sword, then thrust your spear point at a distant point while holding it in your hands. And when he approaches, direct the spear towards the horse's legs and jump to the side to overturn him to the ground.
The idea is certainly difficult to implement, but apparently it was practiced in reality. Note that this is a situation where the enemy rider is without a lance but still on horseback. Earlier, Pseudo-Peter discussed a situation where you need to parry his lance with yours, and the only goal left is the rider himself. Achille Marazzo suggests using a cloak to disorient the enemy's horse.
And when the horse reaches you, I want you to wait and then throw the cloak on its face.
So, did infantrymen chop off horses' legs? The answer is, if possible. It was much safer and more effective to hold a long lance in front of you than to try to shoot the horse's legs. On the other hand, there are many myths about Asian weapons and their use, particularly the belief that the Japanese Adachi sword was designed specifically to chop horses. But that is a topic for a separate video. Let me know in the comments, what weapons would you choose to stop a rider? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to help me promote my channel. Thank you.